Welcome to the Robert Hunt Financial Market Update. It's your host, Robert Hunt, where I look at the week's financial news. It can be a bit confusing, misleading, and take you off course. Now to make it actionable, understandable, and clear. What a week. Whew, what a show. The weather's dropping. It's hot water and lemon season here in Dallas, Texas. Hope you're having as good a weather as we are. And just so that you know, the listener, I had plenty of folks telling me, Robert, don't do a podcast this week. You just bought a puppy dog. And so we did. Short-haired miniature dachshund. I now feel equipped to offer the economics of dog ownership. If that's something you're interested in, you know what button to click. Certainly worth the expense for the puppy dog. Well, we got 3 great articles, though, outside of dog ownership. 3 good articles. I want to revisit Vanguard's capital market expectations. This is where Vanguard comes out and says, we think the U.S. stock market will do this over the next decade. We think the international market will do this over the next decade. We're going back in time to see, well, how effective would it have been to simply have mimicked or copied the recommendations? It's fascinating data. It is. And then a great article by Ann Tergeson at the Wall Street Journal. This is one of our favorites. They have an article that talks about Alicia Monell, who was the director of Boston College's Center for Retirement Research. And it really surprised me, despite her being the director of retirement research, her own grasp of finances. And I thought it actually showed a little bit of wisdom. Something we can learn from. And then in closing, we get to talk about endowments. So it's admittedly one of my pet projects to evaluate endowments, because I think we have an incredible amount to learn from how these endowments perform. And when I say endowments, I'm referencing the Ivies, Texas A&M, Harvard, Princeton, the big 3, and their performance. It's sobering, to say the least. This article talks about venture capital write-downs and how it hit endowments. So at the top, we're actually digging into the Vanguard data. So I was talking to a client about this, and I will bring up Vanguard's capital market expectations data only when a client wants to over-rotate their portfolio to be 100% U.S., which I think is okay. As you know, listener, we've talked about this, both Warren Buffett and John Bogle said it was permissible, yea, even advisable, to put 100% of your net worth in U.S. stocks, because a large portion of the revenue from those companies in the U.S. actually comes from international sources. So you're more diversified than you think. However, because the psychology of money matters and we're not Buffett and Bogle, you're going to have a decade or multiple decades where if you're 100% U.S., you're going to be behind. Will you be able to stick with it? I don't think so. As Macaulay Culkin would say in Home Alone, I don't think so. So I go back, because the RHF market update, we go where other podcasts won't. I go back to 2019 stock market expectations data for Vanguard and check out what they said. This is an article that just referenced the data. You can go back and get the actual data direct, but this was a bit more digestible. Vanguard in 2019 said the outlook for U.S. equities over the next decade was in the 3 to 5% range per year. And they said that you could expect to see equity valuations continue to contract as interest rates rise over time, meaning they thought stocks would actually get a little cheaper over time. They were a little overinflated in their mind in 2019. For non-U.S. equities, international equities, they said investors will see returns in the 6 to 8% range over the next decade. They then go on to opine about the bond market, and they said, again, over the next 10 years, you can expect to see bonds in the global bonds 2.5 to 4.5% range. And so, great. They kind of give you a fuddy-duddy bond expression. But let's go back, shall we? If you had read this study in 2019 and said, aha, see, there you are. I'll rotate into international, because Vanguard sees the valuation today and says that U.S. equities expect 3 to 5% a year, whereas international, 6 to 8%. Well, I can do that math. International is better. Dun, dun, dun. Listener, do you know what happened in the last 5 years? Well, U.S. stocks clocked in at 16.69%, using the S&P 500 as my benchmark. 16.69%. Vanguard said it was 3 to 5. Oh, dear. Oh, dear, dear, dear. I then just look up and I say, oh, well, would I have had a similar kind of whoopsies with international? Yeah, international is not up that much. So international's up about 20% total. That's total. That's not an per annum. That's not an annual figure. That's over the last 5 years. It's up 20% total. And Vanguard had told you to expect 6 to 8%. Now, in Vanguard's defense, they said over the next decade, the decade's not over. But can you imagine if you were just Joe or Jane investor and you decided you were going to rotate into whichever asset class Vanguard thought would do best? Are you going to throw in the towel? I think you will. I don't think you'll have a staying power. I don't think I would either. So I use this Vanguard capital markets forecast not to have people rotate, over tilt, in and out of asset classes. I do it just to convince folks and myself. By the way, I've got to convince myself. All education is self-education, as the great Charlotte Mason once said. I have to convince myself to stay diversified in the face of 16.69% a year S&P 500. I mean, it is a challenge to invest in international stocks. It is a brutal exercise when every single year U.S. stocks go up and you just feel like a Luddite. You just feel like your feet are stuck in the mud. But you go back to the research and you say, yeah, and the research is sound. Vanguard, actually, their capital markets forecast, admittedly in this instance, did not work. I think it's a good lesson. Even the best can fail. Didn't work. But if you read it, if you really want to be a nerd about it and get in there, they do some extensive work on valuation. And oh, by the way, wouldn't you know it? Their capital markets expectations came out, and they expect international to do much better. Could be. We don't know what the next 5 years will be, but I wouldn't want to be not diversified. I think it's the game in investing is permanence. How long can you stick with the plan? Those will be the best investors. And then Ann Tergeson has an article about Alicia Manel, who is at the Boston College Center for Retirement Research. I'd kind of like to walk those halls. I bet that's a interesting group of folks to talk to. But this is Alicia Manel. She is 82 years old. She's an economist, and she's going to step down. Now, this is what was interesting. She says she lacks the time and interest to manage money. What? This shocked me. I had to pick myself up off the floor. She relies on occasional advice from her son, who works at a financial firm. Now, we could probably give a whole speech on listening to your children for financial advice. Sometimes it works out and sometimes it doesn't. Be wary of just taking advice. Trust but verify. Trust but verify those children. But this Alicia Manel, who is the director of Boston College Center for Retirement Research, doesn't feel that she can manage her own money. This is her quote. Every now and then he tells me to send him my asset allocation, and then he tells me how to adjust it. If I had to figure out what to invest in, I'd have no clue, said Manel. People have busy lives. Retirement planning should not be something they have to put a lot of effort into. Now, I agree with that. I certainly agree with that. So there's some wisdom here, and then there's some challenge I'd give her. The wisdom is she acknowledges her limitations. Miss Manel is saying, I don't quite know. And now, if anyone you could accuse of knowing, it would be her. She probably reads about this stuff all the time, but she's saying, no, I don't know. She also talks about financial regrets she had. This is the lady that is director of their Center for Retirement Research. When she left the Federal Reserve at 50, she took bad advice from someone, and instead of letting her monthly pension benefit grow and taking it out later, she took it out then, and on the idea that she would invest the difference and get better returns. Well, wouldn't you know it, she just integrated that into her budget, and she regrets that. She said, wish she hadn't have done it. Wish she hadn't have done it. So she had other things that worked out for her, But I thought this was a really interesting way for us to look at someone who knows a lot, pretty proficient, has the humility to acknowledge her own shortcomings, and yet, wow, would I tell her, you're right about investing. It is simple. You can do this yourself. I would say it's great to get a second set of eyes. Even her son could provide that second set of eyes. But the lesson to us and to everyone is we should all be very careful thinking we've got all the knowledge we need. We don't need to look for others or take advice from others. Anyone would feel like she's got this, it'd be Alicia Manel, who's been doing this research for decades. And yet she says, yeah, I want to get a little second set of eyes on my asset allocation. I want to get a second set of eyes on my money. Not a bad idea. And her son presumably is free, so that's tough to beat. But I think that second set of eyes is invaluable. It can cover a multitude of personal financial sins just to have someone else look over your shoulder. So find someone good that you know what they charge. I recommend hourly. And in closing, Juliet Chung writes, this is for Wall Street Journal, venture capital write-downs hit college endowments. So you probably know what venture capital is. It's that early stage investing, typically in promising high growth companies with the prospect that the company will be worth a great deal in the future. And usually maybe 1 in 20 of these venture capital bets works out and is the next Facebook, whatever, and works out super well. That makes the whole fund. Usually one investment can make the entire round of the entire fund. So I found this interesting. Harvard University's endowment said Thursday it had gained 9.6% for the fiscal year ended June 30. What did they cite as the drag? An absence of gains in private markets. So Harvard is notorious for private equity style, venture capital style. They certainly have access to, goodness, anything and everything. They earned 9.6% for the fiscal year ended June 30. Now, you might be wondering, all right. If they just invested in the index fund, would they have done better? Certainly so. Now, many of my detractors will tell me that's not a fair comparison because endowments have a whole host of other variables they're solving for, namely that university at any time might need the cash, and so they've got to be careful. I'm not really buy it. But you would have been up like 22, 23% in that same period in the U.S. market, just being a fuddy-duddy, clicking a button. Harvard's got armies of analysts. You would have smoked them. Stanford and Dartmouth both gained 8.4%, while Columbia and University of Pennsylvania returned 11.5 and 7.1%. They rounded out with Brown, MIT. These are a couple backup schools for the Aggies listening. And then the median return was 10.1% for U.S. college and university endowments for the period. So, and that's to be expected. The more exposure these endowments would have had to U.S. stock markets, they would have done better. There's a quote here by Greg Dowling of investment consulting firm Fund Evaluation Group. Ugh, that name makes me sad. The quote is, the more liquid equities you had, the better you did. Now, the reason why that name makes me sad is Fund Evaluation Group. Come on now. I don't even know what they're doing, but the name portends that they're telling you which funds will do best in the future, which we know which funds will do best. Cost low. It's a cost game. It's so simple. Warren Buffett went around on a tour trying to convince all these endowments to fire their consultants, like this gentleman, who could be a wonderful man. And he would give the data. He would say, listen, index funds are better. Here's why. You'll be in the top 5% of investors over a 20-year period. It'll beat what you've done historically. None of them took his advice. This is Buffett. Conflicts of interest abounded. He couldn't do it. So they give reasons for this. They say, well, we are more diversified than a straightforward stock market investment. So Harvard's got $53 billion. And their chief says we have lower risk. So we're going to lag sometimes. But during downturns, we won't do as poorly, he says. So also they're asking us not to zero in and be too myopic. The quote here is, the success or failure of private investments can only be properly evaluated over long time periods that capture complete market cycles, provide ample opportunity for innovation to take hold, and enable business improvements to bear fruit. I'm not going to argue that. It's the University of Virginia Investment Management Company, Mr. Robert Durden. I won't argue with that. But for us, I know here he only earned 7.5% the past fiscal year. That's a man that's certainly defending his philosophy. But for us, for you and I, we don't have to go down that road, and we can tell. And in this past fiscal year, we absolutely, for the U.S. investor, smoked those endowments. That won't always be the case. But when you look at this disparity in effort, energy, the general administrative cost associated with running these endowments, with a click of your button, you outperform them all. It's one of the great paradoxes in the world today, is that you can do it. Now, it takes, I think, a steady dose of the Robert Hunt Financial Market Update or something similar to it. You got to hear that sermon every week. And because why do you have to hear it? Because, it's tough to stay on it sometimes. There can be a whole host of reasons why people want you to get off the narrow road and go to the wide path filled with fees and that leads to mediocre returns instead of the narrow path, which leads to excellent returns. So stay on that narrow path. How do you stay on that narrow path? I never thought you'd ask. Keep your costs low, your investing simple, and your time horizon long, because that's what's going to give you the best shot on your investing journey. Until next time.